Hey, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. In September of 2018, for those of you who have been listening for a while, we had Jill Violet on the show, and she was talking about the power of play. And she referenced an opinion piece in the New York Times from earlier that month that talked about how all the skills that you learn while playing are the foundation of our democracy. So conclusion and empathy and respecting the rights of others and that kind of thing are the same skills that we need to successfully navigate our democracy. And so it's those soft skills that we teach in school, both explicitly and implicitly, that have such a bearing on our lives as we grow up and become hopefully functioning adults in our society today. For this episode, I had the honor of sitting down with Dawn Stern to talk about the program that she and her husband tour with around the country to help veterans re-assimilate and deal with trauma that they've experienced while in service or before then. And their program called DeCruit, which she'll explain more about it, but it uses Shakespeare to help veterans access those parts within themselves that maybe need to be examined and recognized, but have been so buried because of trauma and because of cultural stigma and what all, that until their workshops and shows have been inaccessible. So it was a real honor to sit down with Dawn. You can look her up on IMDb. She has quite the page because she herself is an actress in her own right, and she and her husband, Stefan Wolfert, have created this program to help veterans, as I said, navigate trauma. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the power of not just Shakespeare necessarily, although he plays an important role in today's conversation, but theater in itself, and how just some of those skills that you learn in theater as an actor can help in everyday skills. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dawn Stern.
Welcome to the Teacher's Classroom, the podcast that explores current topics in education with your host, Matt Weld.
All right, and welcome to this episode of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. I am here today with Dawn Stern, and we are going to be talking about using theater and specifically Shakespeare on helping people with trauma. Dawn and her husband, Stefan, have a nonprofit that she's going to be talking about. And I think it's a really cool thing because they actually travel around the country and help veterans who have experienced trauma just by being veterans and everything that's involved with that. But I think that it's applicable to all the trauma conversations that we've had on this podcast. We've talked about the trauma of teaching. We've talked about the trauma in the adults in the building. We've talked about the trauma for kids and how to, look through the trauma lens and all that kind of thing. So this is just another facet of how the science in trauma is really coming to the forefront, and different groups are responding to it and seeing how we can help people, not just kids and teachers in the classroom, but also, all people from everywhere who have experienced trauma. So Dawn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I love it.
Can you just tell us a little bit about DeCruit, like what it is and your mission and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, I would love to. DeCruit is a nonprofit, a 501c3 that my husband, Stefan Wolfert, founded. He's an Army veteran. He was in for 8 years. And he had an extraordinarily traumatic event happen, several, while he was in the military, and the last one being his best friend in service was killed inside a armored personnel vehicle with him in front of him, and it caused him to take leave for a little bit, and he hopped on an Amtrak train. He got off in Montana, tooled around the town, and did something a farming boy from Wisconsin had never done in his life before that, and that is he walked into a theater, and he sat down, he put his rucksack down, and he sat down, the lights went dark, and out walked this soldier in uniform. It was Richard III, and basically started a monologue that said, "The war's over. It's done. And I don't know what to do now. I'm shaped for war. I'm misshaped for society. Now what?" And he said it was the first monologue of the show. And yet he sat in the audience transfixed, having a cathartic moment, started crying. He thought people were looking at him, and he didn't know why, but he knew that his military service was probably over. And he said he knew in that moment, or really the next day, he went to the bookstore looking for Richard III and found the book, opened the book, started reading it, couldn't understand any of it, went and rented the movie and used the book to follow along the movie. But that's what a profound effect it had when another person was on stage telling the story that he thought was his life. Mm-hmm. And that's where it really all began. And after 20 years of speaking with veterans and their family members, working with psychiatrists and psychologists, and experts in the trauma field, one of his colleagues is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, which is probably the best book on trauma I've ever read. And after a decade of doing this work, I've read a lot of them. He works with him. He created this program because what he realized when he went back to the Army, resigned his commission, he went to graduate school for theater to be an actor, which his parents thought were crazy. No, he never stepped on, he didn't have, that's not his undergraduate degree, was history. That was not his field at all. He never stepped on a stage, never wanted to be an actor. That was how profound it was. And then along the way, he discovered a lot of things that made him different from the graduate students that were in university and in school that weren't veterans. And he marked those. And then for his thesis, he actually did a part of Richard III, but instead of saying Shakespeare, he used his story and then a little bit of Shakespeare. And so what happened in the development of these 2 decades since and working and realizing that this is now the work he wanted to do is he realized that the tenets of classical actor training, a lot of breath control, and exercises and games that have to do with self-observation, literally the ability to observe what is happening in your body and where it is happening, that it helped him. It helped him with some of the things that he knew he was struggling with out of the Army. And that was the impetus for really creating DeCruit. And he says that that military veterans are recruited, and as you know, on campuses, they're recruited at a psychologically malleable age. They're taken into the service, and then they're trained for war. And science has now proven that they have been wired for war, that there's actual wiring that happens in the brain that teaches them. And the U.S. military industrial complex is very, very, very good at it. One of the best in the world, but it isn't unique to the U.S. military. But that training that they go through, just the training, we're not even talking about any experience of combat, just the training itself rewires the brain in part to respond to a threat with violence. It's what they need for them to do the job, not think. They need them to follow orders without thought, to eliminate the threat, right? So all of that training and science has now proven that these brains are different, much like football players are now, they have proven that these repeated concussions, surprise, surprise, the brain doesn't like to be batted around, creates TBI, right? So they've also looked at military veterans' brains, and they see stress and where PTS is, and that this training changes them. So you have this, you're going in and you're now wired for war. And then you have, on top of that, whatever experience your military experience is. It could be great. You could see things you didn't want to see or do things you didn't know that you were going to be doing. There's all kinds of experiences, but no matter what they are, when you leave service, there's no training or testing to make sure that you're fit for society. So there's all this testing and training to go in to the service, to stay in service, to make sure that you're fit for service and that you're only a danger to the enemy, not to yourself, not to your unit. But when you get out, there's no testing or training to make sure you're fit for society. So this is where he thought the gap was for veterans like him, that he knew he had something going on that wasn't quite normal. He knew his rage wasn't at a normal level over things that shouldn't be that, right? So he knew he had something going on, but he was never, nor do these young men and women who serve, part of the military culture is that they're not going to go to the VA for help if they're coming back in what they call physical, because the emphasis is on physical health. They're not going to go stand in front of veterans who have traumatic brain injuries and are missing limbs for help at the VA. So he realized that there was a whole world of veterans like him that maybe weren't traditionally wounded with what people could see, but had these what now is called invisible wounds, and that maybe also didn't get help with a psychiatrist's office. So they have no diagnosis of PTSD, but there's this whole gap and basket of veterans that know something's wrong, that are having difficulties, but aren't able to get themselves into a psychiatrist's office and stay, or get themselves to the VA. And even if they did, there's wait lines for both of those. Mm-hmm. So, but that he did realize that he was helped by this classical actor training. So that's the impetus and how DeCruit started. And we say our mission is treating trauma with science and Shakespeare, because that's what worked for him. That's what spoke to him. And the science part of it is cognitive processing therapy, narrative therapy, breathing-based relaxation techniques. And the Shakespeare is a whole different thing. I know you're going to ask me why Shakespeare. I know.
She can read my mind, because exactly why Shakespeare and why not,
right.
I don't know, somebody else.
Anything else, right. So, and he, because his major is history, you have to realize he would be much more specific with this. But Shakespeare wrote a great deal about veterans and war. He's famous, and one of the reasons he's classic is because he wrote so well about the condition of being human, the human condition. But he also wrote in what we call iambic pentameter, which is da-dun, 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 right? 5. But it's also the natural rhythm of the human heartbeat. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. To be or not to be, that is the question. So that's a line of verse, right? So there was something about being trained as a classical actor to speak the verse and breathe in before each verse that put him in regulation in a way that nothing else did. Right? You have other classics and other classics that write about war, but there's something about Shakespeare that's meant to be spoken out loud. Number one, it's not meant to be read like the other classics. It's meant to actually have the words in your mouth. It's written in this iambic pentameter, which is the natural rhythm of the human heartbeat. And then he writes about war and the condition of being human. Shakespeare's characters walk out on stage and they talk directly to you. They discuss directly with you. They say, I have a problem. Help me figure it out. Should I kill myself or should I wait for more information? Should I wash the blood off my hands and go pretend I'm sleeping and that I didn't just kill the king or not? Mm-hmm. So he says they speak what they feel, not what they ought to say. So where veterans and people who have suffered trauma, because now we also work with family of veterans, we've also had occasion because women and men, male veterans have suffered from MST, with the military sexual trauma. So we've had occasion to work with, rape survivors, because they so often lack the language. And when you go into your limbic system, that the higher language and reasoning centers of your brain, when you're having a traumatic response, those shut down anyway. So even if you had the language, it's not available to you at that moment, which is why so often when someone's having a fit, say in a classroom, and you go, calm down, it doesn't work because they're not even able to hear you. Right. So, speaking the language, which they have proved scientifically, speaking Shakespeare actually turns on these the areas of the brain that process language and speak language. So you're coming now out of the limbic, the PTS brain, and you're coming into your higher logic. Just breathing and speaking the language, you can interrupt that trauma response. So that's really the basis of why Shakespeare. It gives them language. Also, learning a foreign language turns on those sections of the brain, right? And Shakespeare is Old English. Kind of it's so a foreign language, even for Americans who speak English. Nobody speaks, Old English, right? So that's why Shakespeare, and the proof is really in the pudding. He really started, it started all as an experiment and with a huge passion and desire to not have somebody suffer like he did. It took him 10 years after he was out to reach out and ask for help. And there's a lot of, self-destructive behavior and self-medicating behavior that made things worse. Whereas if he had only known really how the brain works on trauma, and then things that might interrupt the trauma response, breath exercises, games, and things that might interrupt that response, he might have been able to move himself to health a little earlier. And that's really what he wanted to do for other veterans. And that's really how it started.
And so the veteran groups that you're with, are the veterans who, do they choose to come to your... Okay, so yes. It's like a self-select.
Right now, it is self-selecting, and we see an extraordinary cross-section of veterans. And I think the thing that surprised us most and that saddened us the most were the elders that came, the veterans. We had veterans from the Korean War. We had veterans from Vietnam, and not just the current conflicts that we are in. And for many of them, they told us, this is the first time I've ever said this out loud. And then they would speak forth the most horrific stories that have only been kept inside. And no wonder they're doing damage. Mm-hmm. Because Jonathan Shea, who wrote this book on killing psychiatrist who studied Vietnam veterans. And he says, trauma can really only be healed by the communalization of it. You must feel heard and listened to, and that someone else is caring, understands, and can help you carry. It's the final part for many people of the releasing of it. And that it's not the executive voice in your head ordering everything, or like you say, the trauma lens of everything that you see through. So the room is very important. So the cross section of veterans shocked us. It's really the young ones, the veterans that just get out, that have very much of difficulty. There seems to be a process they need to go to. They get out. They don't want to be veterans. They don't want to be heroes. They don't want parades. They just want to be back. Right. And then it takes a while. Then stuff starts getting in the way. So it takes a while. So oftentimes and look, right now, the military is, to the best of my knowledge, is set up in a way that if a veteran asks for help, so they do ask, do you need help? But if a veteran asks for help and they're in Afghanistan, and so they ask, does anyone here need help or having any problems sleeping and having any PTSD symptoms? If you say yes, you stay in country right there to get help while your unit goes back home. So miraculously, not many of them say they have problems there, right? So it's not the one that, so we don't, I guess that was the biggest shocker, is that we had older veterans who had never spoken their stories, and their family members reported they came back changed and different, but never said anything, would not talk about it. And then the second biggest shocker was, we thought, when we were giving writing prompts, DeCruit is delivered usually over 8 weeks. It's 3 hours a week. The final week is an open class, what we call a final presentation, where they're telling a personal narrative given from a writing prompt with a Shakespeare monologue that they choose themselves with a formula that we've devised, which basically their personal narrative is brings up. We basically give them a huge board of emotions, and when they get the prompts and they write for 15 minutes on this prompt, and then we don't even need them to read it. It's not about hearing it, because they can read it to themselves, and just the act of writing and you asking will bring it up for them, and so they'll go through all of those emotions. And so we say, which emotions now are you dealing with the most? And then that emotion is matched to a series of monologues that Stefan edited down for the veteran perspective. We've now since also worked in prison, and we have another set of monologues that works for prison. So you can do the same thing. You worked with high school students and things that mean something to them. So you go, oh, you're dealing with shame or guilt from killing. Then it's Richard III, right? And here so he's pre-edited them. So the old English jokes it's not about being an actor. It's not about saying the words pretty. It's about saying what you don't think you can say out loud. It's about saying how you really feel, not I'm fine, right? So they're edited, they're decontextualized for the veteran experience. And so their own personal narrative, they get matched with the monologue. And that final presentation is the combination of them standing up in front of an invited audience. It's only they that have the power to invite people. They invite sometimes their workmates who never even knew they were sitting next to a veteran, sometimes family members who never heard them speak one story about war. And the experience, what's great is after 8 weeks, so they've gotten enough of these techniques that we've given them. And now they're in front of an audience, which is more than the class, which was a secure space for them. So then they go through all of those trauma responses, and then they're able to see that they can use the techniques that they were given and come through the other side. And that's also what the Shakespeare does. So what we witness in the room is the personal narrative oftentimes puts them back into trauma. You see them shake, or you see the voice, right? That the vagus nerve affects everything. Right. So people have different responses, all kinds of different responses. And then we have them breathe in, say a line of text, breathe in, say another line of Shakespeare. Sometimes they cry because they start to make connections or cry or get angry or doesn't matter what's happening. Breathe in. You're coached. Breathe in, say the next line. And when they get through, they're through. And they learn, now they're teaching their bodies, the trauma doesn't have to rule. I can get through. I can interrupt it and I can come through. So we teach them grounding techniques, breathing techniques, and these things really came from classical actor training. And, and I'm talking to you know this, but the arts and sciences were never separated and they were never meant to be. It's part of who a whole human being is. So it's a little bit ridiculous to think it's some frivolous thing and it has nothing to do. Just like we accept very readily that sports make an individual a whole individual that is able to be have discipline, learn teamwork, learn camaraderie, learn all these things. Well, you learn the same thing in the arts, and also self-regulation over what your body is doing. You have to know these things. So I think that's kind of where it started, and what the kind of the shape of this eight week workshop, and that culminates in a final presentation. That's kind of what DeCruit, the program, looks like.
Yeah. So a couple of reactions here. First of all, that final performance.
He just had one. Monday was Veterans Day. He just had one.
I can't even imagine how, I'm getting all emotional just thinking about what it's probably like. Also, you mentioned the power of community and how that's necessary for healing.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I'm now making a connection to another book I'm reading by Brené Brown when she deals with shame.
Yes.
And she says when she's talking about her own shame and when she feels ashamed, she needs to reach out and build a community.
Yes.
So she doesn't go into that self spiral rabbit hole thing.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they're both, I think as humans, we evolved as communal social animals, right? Like the families used to raise the ants and everybody
Tribal,
used to raise everybody. And now that we're so disconnected and trying to reconnect with technology, but that's a whole other story.
Yes. Yes. I think, but we do deal with this crisis of disconnection is very prevalent, and camaraderie is the very factor that is the difference between two veterans that have had the exact same experience, and one suffering from PTSD and the other not. Camaraderie is the biggest factor. So if you had, and I think, did I say the second? So I said the second, the biggest surprise was the plethora of how far back the veterans who walked into the room who are self-selecting. The veterans who self-select come to this are the ones who've tried. The elders are the ones who've tried everything and nothing's worked. And they don't know Shakespeare. They don't want to be actors, but they're like, I'll try anything. Right. And then the young ones that come, there are some young ones that are interested in the arts or don't want to see a psychiatrist, but want something, and they come for the camaraderie. And, theater is full of a bunch of people where they feel right at home. But what the second surprise, I don't know if I finished this, but the second surprise was I went on the writing prompts in the program and I didn't get to. The second surprise is that when they finished the question, the incident that affected me most, we thought that they were going to tell us about a military trauma. But in fact, almost 100% of the veterans who went through the program wrote about childhood trauma. Really? Wrote about an incident that happened in their childhood.
I would never.
And that is what shocked us the most. But now that we worked with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Ed Tronick, and now I understand it's the childhood trauma for close to 70% of veterans. It's the childhood trauma that makes the selected military so promising for them in the first place. Because what do all the ads for the military promise? Respect, You will be honored and you will be respected. You will be listened to. You will be saluted and you will salute. You will handle multi-million-dollar equipment. You will have the respect of so if you don't grow up with that, if you grow up being abused, if you grow up being neglected, if you grow up, with emotional trauma that says that you're not valued, how perfect. This is what not to mention, of course, college. I want a college education and I want, right. But so it's very attractive, the things that they know, that's why I said recruited at a psychologically malleable age. So now you're in, right. And you have this. So for Stefan, he says, I grew up believing his actual word is a piece of doo-doo, but he doesn't use doo-doo, but I'm not going to swear, but he says, piece of, he said, I grew up believing that I was. And lo and behold, I go into the military service. And for the first 6 weeks of basic training, what do they call me? A piece of.
Right.
Right. He goes, I felt right at home. I thought, and they remake you. You're no longer a dirty civilian. You are an airman, a soldier, a Marine. They remake you. And now you're not that person anymore. You're this new person. Now you're walking. So when he got out, he was like, so who am I without that? And now I'm getting out and I'm looking for work and I'm catering and I'm doing all of this stuff and people aren't saluting me and then depression. And then I've lost the unit and the camaraderie of the people that I served with that I would die for, who had my back and I had theirs. They're gone because they've all gone to separate places. So now what? And so camaraderie is, a really big factor in trauma. It has to be. I think this program works. They say strength based because the veterans helped formulate the program. And we say one of the things we say when they walk in the door is congratulations. No matter what you did prior to walking in this room, you made it in this room, and 22 veterans a day didn't. So it's an apology-free zone. It's a shame-free zone. And we work on reconnecting. And this work and that's what the final presentations are so powerful, is because the community gets to hear from their own veterans, not from Hollywood movie, not from a study, from the veterans that are in their community. You're coming and you're listening to the veterans that are in your community tell their truths and their stories. And then people from the community, and this is the hopeful part, we watch people from the community stand up. They're so moved. They want to support. They just don't know how. But I'm telling you now, a parade is not it.
Right.
It's not it. They need to be listened to, really heard, and they need support in a different way. And so do their family members. But we see community members go, I'm a dentist. Here's my card. I'll clean any veteran's teeth. Then they're a part of the solution. And the final thing I'll leave you with is Yvette Nolan, who is Algonquin she's in Saskatoon right now. And she is, obviously, for obvious reasons, she gave us and allowed us to borrow this term, this medicine circle, because we don't have leaders. We don't have gurus. We are all responsible in the circle, in the room, for having each other's back and securing the room. People with trauma know there's really no such place as a safe space. That you can't make it safe for them because of the trauma that they've suffered and the lens that they look through, but you can secure the space. And so that's that this model of ritualing. We have a ritual in and we have a ritual out, and that is the bookends. And then we're in the circle, and she's the one who wrote a book, Theater's Medicine, and our medicine circle, and I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard it. I've listened to it. I've seen the community that wants to help and didn't know. They just didn't know. They've got, some Hollywood movie in their mind about what veterans are and what they need. And they really, I think civilians are there and want to help, but they just don't know how. And I think veterans want to reach out for help, but they don't know how. And so I think into this gap come we in our Sprinter van. But there are others doing this work too, so it's good.
Well, yeah. And so just to kind of bring it back to school, I guess.
Yeah.
So the power of community.
Yes. Can I tell you a story? I want to tell you a high school student story.
Okay. Yeah, do it.
So somebody invited him in the Midwest, but it was Michigan, but invited him to a high school to do Cry Havoc. They saw his show. His Cry Havoc is his one-man show, and it's his story. And it's really the origin story of DeCruit. And the story of a lot of veterans and the difficulties they face in transitioning and specifically why. And then it's intermingled with the Shakespeare monologues that are suited for that. So it's this brilliant 75-minute piece. So they invite him into this high school. Now he's used to performing at theaters or trauma conferences and things like that. Mm-hmm. So high school, vets have language, strong language, and it's images of warfare. And so he tells them, what kind of high school do you have? I don't know. He goes, I can clean it up. I can take out the cuss words, but it's still images of war. And then, in my words, and then in Shakespeare's words. And they said, no, this is what we want. Trust us. Our students need this. So he does Cry Havoc. He's scared to death. At first they're all fidgety, and then it gets quieter and quieter, like a pin drop. And then afterwards, this really tall, like Paul Bunyan-sized boy comes up to him, red in the face. And he just knew that he's just holding tears back. And he said, hey, how are you? He introduced him. And the boy said, is that your story? What I just saw, is that your story? And he said, yes, it's my story. And he walked away. And Stefan answered a few more questions, and then he came back and he said, I didn't know that a man could be vulnerable like that on stage. And he looked at him and he said, so you're a big guy, huh? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, so people want you to be tough. They expect that you're tough. He said, his lips started quivering. He didn't answer. And he said, but they want you to fight all the time, fight people, right? They drag you into fights and want you to fight. And starts quivering more, and then tears just start popping down his eyes. And he said, you don't want to fight, do you? And he said, no, I don't want to fight. So this show that he did to work on his military trauma, and then we find out it's just trauma, childhood trauma. It's not even military trauma. It's not, there's not the trauma Olympics. And then he realized, oh my God, it's so apropos to a whole lot of people that. Well,
then we get into gender expectations.
Exactly. But he saw Stefan, this manly military veteran, doing Shakespeare in theater, which in many communities is not to this day. It's ridiculous. To this day, boys aren't supposed to be dancers and boys aren't supposed to be in theater. And if you are, that makes you effeminate in some way. So gender is all in it. And same with the military. Gender and gender biases are all up in the trauma, especially for this new generation of kids that just don't see the world the way we were grown up to see it. They're just not confined in that way. So, he, she, hers, the right. Gender, whether we know it or not, this is some of the trauma, and the vulnerability is part of it. So, yeah.
Well, Dawn, thank you. I think we're just going to leave it right there. It's all. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Well, it was more Stefan's story. But
I'm in it. Family members are in it. We see it. We witness it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I've seen Cry Havoc a couple times, and it moves me every time. So, yeah. So thank you for being here and for sharing your story.
Thank you.
For this episode's show notes, past episodes, or how you can earn professional development hours for listening, visit teachillinois.com, your online portal for teacher learning. Thanks for listening.
Thanks to everybody for listening to this episode. And stay tuned. In the next couple of weeks, we are going to have a big announcement here on the Teacher's Classroom and Teach Illinois on, well, I can't really say anything, but it'll be a way for this podcast to be even more valuable to you. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening. If you could do me one eensy-teensy favor and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening, if it's iTunes or Google or Spreaker or whichever platform you're using. And if you could leave a review, that helps us reach more people to become more visible on those platforms. So with gratitude from my heart to yours, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.